call the meeting at 6:04. And do we have a city staffer here? We got to do something about getting the lights sequenced throughout, because I went through 7 lights on Monterey Road. Every one is red.
Go the back way.
I think, Walter, you're at the wrong meeting. This is...
Yeah, that's the transportation subcommittee.
I'm equal opportunity. Okay, we have, we're going to do burrowing owls as we get through the beginning. So I've called the meeting to order, and if we could do the roll call.
Chair Glines.
Present.
Committee members Hintermeister.
Here.
Truss-Garfink.
Here.
Edgerton.
Here.
Wolf. Oliver.
Here.
Hutchinson.
Okay, and the Farm Bureau person, has she been approached? What's
Yes, in the executive officer's report, I'll give you an update on that. Yeah.
Okay, then report of the chair. I was going through the minutes, and if we could have the 3-minute time limit for speakers at the public hearings and at the and agenda items, so that we can have that. And then also on the cover sheets leading into it, if we could get Ed, your name on there somewhere, the attorney's name on there, just so as a public person coming in, and then it'll help them some, I think.
Okay, yes, we can do that.
And then also the board members as well, their names, but if that could also include, and if you guys could weigh in, I was thinking that it would include, such as I represent the public, we have the environment, and I'm not sure if it would be helpful. I think it might, but I'm not, jumping up and down about it, but what city you're from, because it gives a little bit of knowledge about who, but I think the first 2 are really good ideas. On the other one, I'm not certain. Does anyone have any?
Seems reasonable to me.
Well, I have just one suggestion too. I wouldn't mind if they put the executive officer's email on there, so that if the public wants to contact any of us, they could do that through the executive officer and not have to get each of our...
That would be fine and dandy, and our email should be on the website for individual members as well.
It is.
Okay. And then that's basically my report. Thank you. And so we'll now move on to advisory member announcements. And if we could start with Julie and just come across.
Nope. Sorry. I have none.
Okay. Dick? Okay. Craig?
No, I'm fine.
I'm good.
Okay. And Jan?
I don't know if anybody's going to mention that November 19th HCP workshop in Vacaville.
I wasn't, so go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is. I actually have never gone to one of these, but I've heard they're really very, very informative. Every year there's a meeting of scientists, administrators, various people that are involved in habitat conservation plans all over California. And the annual meeting this year is November 19th. And I actually had printed out a couple applications. I forgot them in the car. But if anyone's interested, it's a one-day workshop. There's bee presenters from different parts of California, people working on different HCPs. And I'm sure if you search for it, you could find it.
We could send the notice.
I think that'd be worthwhile.
I could have Angie send the notice out to.
And should that also go to the implementation and governing board members as well, or what's the target audience?
Yeah, it's really You,
okay.
consultants, electeds, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the ideas is it's, there's opportunities for lessons learned, from other HCPs, and just, kind of feedback from the different organizations that have been involved in California.
Jan? I'm sorry. I just want to say thanks for bringing that up. I've attended it the last 3 years, and I'll be attending this one as well. I'm already registered, so I can bring back to the committee a report on it if they like.
And is there a website where we could sign up for email notes and other stuff that they send out? Just and you can look at it or not, but I find information incredibly value if I have time to get to it, and I try to. I mean, do you think that would be worth it if we board members had that opportunity?
I think it'd be worthwhile because it is an annual thing. So I think it'll come up if you don't go this year. There'll be an opportunity next year. And I'm not sure of the website, but maybe that's something we can find out as well.
They may have one, but I can't recall. I know they do send out the information once the conference is over, but usually all notification is just strictly through email, and even the registration. You can't register online. You have to mail that in, so it's a little bit low tech in that sense.
Okay, thank you. And now we're at the point of the agenda. Do we have any comments from anyone who wants to bring up or talk about any item or items that are not on the agenda? Hearing none, we'll move on. And then approval of the minutes of the May 1 regular meeting of the Public Advisory Committee. Could I have a motion and a second for approval?
Second.
Do we have any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, item number 2, approve the minutes of the August 7 regular meeting of the Public Advisory Committee. If I could have a motion and a second for approval?
Second.
Thank you. And is there any discussion? Okay, let's then, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Number 3, we get to hear about the burrowing owl strategy that is near and dear to many of us, or not the strategy, but definitely the burrowing owl, and that's why we're getting into the strategy. And Ed, are you the lead off for that?
Just in terms of introducing the speaker is Troy Rumke. He represents ICF Jones and Stokes, who's working with the Habitat Agency to implement the burrowing owl conservation strategy for the plan. And after he speaks, it sort of ties into the next item. We're going to begin the process of implementing our first management agreement with the Don Edwards Warm Springs unit to try to enhance burrowing owl populations out at that site. So,
Okay.
Thank you. So
Thank you.
Kick it off over to Troy here.
Thanks. Again, I know some of you, but not all of you. So my name is Troy Ramick with ICF International, and I've been involved with the development of the HCP and CCP since I don't even know for how long, around 2005. So since the inception, October 2005. Yeah, Craig and I and Jan and others have been doing that for a long time. So one of the principal things that I've been involved in as part of that process has been the development of the burrowing owl conservation strategy, which is, as you'll hear over the next several minutes, I think the most unique part of the HCP, and there's many reasons for that, and I'll explain those to you. And the hope tonight, I think, was really just it's a fairly complex part of the HCP and CCP, and so just to give you as much background as we can in 20 minutes or so, so that as decisions are being made going forward relative to the strategy, you'll have a little bit of a basis for kind of where that stuff's coming from. So kind of an informational item, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So start off with a little bit of history. The burrowing owls have been somewhat confounding to people who have been trying to save them for a number of years in the Santa Clara Valley. And the map that's in front of you there is our habitat suitability model that we put together for the species, and this is the basis for our impact analysis and our conservation strategy that we developed that's in the plan. One of the things that's interesting, and the reason I start with this, is that there's really kind of three different types of burrowing owl habitat that we're dealing with here, and we've defined them this way. And the green you see there is what we call occupied burrowing owl habitat. That's places where we know that there are nesting burrowing owls, and we also include a buffer of a half a mile off of those known nest locations within that area. Craig?
So when you refer to occupied habitat, you're talking about nesting.
That's correct.
So foraging habitat, you don't count here.
That is correct.
Okay.
Well, foraging as it relates to being adjacent to a breeding site.
Right,
Yep.
but for non-breeding sites, that's not included on here.
That's correct, not in the green. So then as you look at the other two, going down the valley, we have this kind of yellow color. That's what we term potential burrowing owl habitat. So that's valley bottom, flat grassland habitat that has ground squirrels, etc. Looks like it should be loaded with burrowing owls. Typically isn't. There aren't a lot of burrowing owls down there, or really none now. But it has potential. And then what you see up in the hills then, the orange color is, for lack of a better term, we've called it kind of overwintering only habitat. And the reason for that term is actually they overwinter in all of these habitat types. They could be anywhere in the wintertime. We typically are only finding them during the winter up in the hills, although there's recent and some recent observations of there are potentially being owls in the hills during the nesting season. And so that's something that we're trying to run down. But anyway, so we have these three different kinds of habitat. And the reason I start off with that is because a lot of our focus right now, and a lot of what I'm going to be talking about tonight, is really focused on the nesting habitat, the occupied habitat, what you see in the green there. One of the reasons why the species has been so difficult to work with in this capacity is that most of the burrowing owls in the South Bay area are actually outside of our study area. So in the graphic you see the red line there, that's the bound HCP, NCCP study area boundary. The stars represent areas where we know that there are owls, or there have historically been a pretty viable colony or colonies of owls. And you'll see that most of them are outside of the study area. There's, just to give you a little bit of reference, so that's the San Jose Airport. This here is the Water Pollution Control Plant bufferlands up there north of 237. And then as you the Warm Springs area, which we'll be talking about later, is up here in Fremont, and Moffett Airfield over here, and Shoreline at Mountain View, the golf course, has owls. So we had this issue where we're trying to conserve a species through this plan, but most of the birds that we're trying to conserve are outside of the boundary. So we had to kind of think differently about the species. And so what we did in that regard was come up with what we call the expanded study area for burrowing owl conservation. Really long name for that, but essentially on the map here, it's this purple boundary that kind of runs up around the fringe of the bay. And the intent of including that area in the planning effort was because we knew that that's where a lot of the conservation activity for the species is going to have to happen. So that's this is the only species out of all the covered species where we can do conservation outside of our study area, but it has to be inside of this purple boundary, inside of this expanded study area. And the reason why that's important, and the reason why we had to draw a line on the map was essentially when we were going through the CEQA and NEPA analysis on the plan, we had to define that area for the NEPA analysis. So we had to say this is where conservation activities are going to be happening. So they can't just be anywhere in Alameda County or anywhere up up in the Central Valley or something. So it has to be in that area. So the development of the strategy, as I said, was kind of one of the most unique and kind of complicated parts of the whole plan, which was complicated in and of itself. But we had a technical team of burrowing owl experts that we met dozens of times to kind of develop the strategy. So this wasn't just kind of something that was done behind closed doors, in a vacuum. It was definitely a group effort with a couple of lead folks, myself and Jack Barclay, who is a burrowing owl specialist, and then a whole bunch of other agency staff, other consultants, et cetera, to kind of put it together. One of the key things, and I mentioned it already, was this idea of defining occupied burrowing owl habitat as being not just nest locations, but the the foraging habitat that's around those nest locations. So previous to this effort, and still in other parts of the state, conservation or protection of burrowing owls through CEQA is really focused on nest sites. So there's a lot of interest in where are the birds nesting and then just protecting those areas. And what we wanted to do was deal with the reality that they wouldn't be nesting there if there wasn't foraging habitat around the nest sites. And so we wanted to kind of give that foraging habitat equal weight as the nest location itself. So that kind of forms the basis of what ends up being the fee base for the burrowing owl conservation strategy. So the areas that are subject to the burrowing owl conservation fee are these areas that are within a half mile, basically, of known nest locations and have suitable habitat. So it's already developed, no fee. But if it's a grassland site within a half mile of a known nest location, it would be subject to the fee, essentially. So that was, it seems like a small thing, but defining that area, the half mile boundary around the nest sites was actually a pretty big deal, and actually more controversial than you think it might be on both sides of the issue, both at the agencies, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and with the development community.
You say a half-mile radius, right?
Yeah,
That's what we're talking about.
that's right. Yep, and that's there's nothing really magical about that number. It's loosely based on data that we have from the South Bay that, there's been some radio telemetry studies that show that, owls spend about 80% of when they're nesting, they spend about 80% of their time within a half mile of the nest site itself. It was one study, but it's all we had, so we're using the best data we have, and we used that half mile buffer to kind of do that. So a lot of people
on the same question or the same point, so what about burrowing out elsewhere? Is the half mile, not universal, but almost universal?
It's actually not universal. So that small of an area around a nest site is actually pretty unique to an urban situation like we have here in North San Jose or the South Bay. You get out to the plains of Alberta or Wyoming or something like that, and owls, because resources are lower, less to eat. They'll have huge, they'll forage really far from their nest sites. So I think in the South Bay, they probably would love to forage further from their nest sites. There just isn't a lot of space. And so they use what they have. So it's, maybe less of a preference of the owls and more this, like that's over time, that's all that's left. And so that's what they're using. So it's definitely not universal.
Thank you.
Yeah. So lots of people have been involved in this. I won't read off the list, but from all the local jurisdictions, all of the permittees under the habitat plan, we kind of had points of contact inside of each of those agencies. A lot of people, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, were involved. Dave Johnston, who has been our kind of like point of contact for years and still is, was involved, and then a few people, kind of further up the chain in the department, Esther Burkett and Brenda Johnson, who are both have a history and research experience with the species, and also happen to be pretty high up in the department themselves. So they were heavily involved in the development of the strategy. So we were breaking new ground with it. And so because of that, there was a lot of interest from the Department of Fish and Wildlife and how it was going to play out, and there still is, because the jury's out, as you'll find out. What we were really focused on here was this idea of regional recovery. So I mentioned that most of the birds right now are outside of our study area. So we really had to think about this species from a regional perspective. So we can try to save all the burrowing owls inside of our study area in a couple of locations where we have them. But if we don't pay attention to what's happening in Fremont and Mountain View and Sunnyvale and Santa Clara, our efforts may be all for naught, because there just aren't enough burrowing owls left in the South Bay to give us a lot of flexibility in that regard. So by creating this expanded burrowing owl study area, it was really trying to pull all of these areas together and simply say, hey, we're all in this together. Those other entities that are outside of the study area, they're not subject to the HCP, NCCP, but with respect to burrowing owls, we all have to begin to coordinate on this issue, because one can't sort of persist without the other. So that's why we were really focused on this regional idea. And so we had to then think, well, what does regional recovery look like for the species? We've been surveying out for owls for years in the South Bay area, but there are 3 locations where surveys have been consistently done using the same methodology for a long period of time. Those areas are shown here on the map, and that's Moffett Airfield, Shoreline, Mountain View, and the San Jose Airport. And what we did was use those as kind of index sites, so they have, maybe say 13 or 14, maybe 15 years of consistent data at those locations now. So we were looking at how the population at those 3 locations were behaving over time to help us project what we needed to see in terms of numbers of owls in the entire South Bay area. So what we did, I'm not going to sort of belabor this, but we did what you call a population viability analysis, which is just looking at the changes in the population over time and trying to figure out how many owls do you need to add to the population every year to ensure that it doesn't crash and go locally extinct. So that's basically what the population viability analysis is. It's a whole appendix in the habitat plan that you can read about if you're really interested. But what we determined was, at least at those 3 locations, was that over time we need to be adding 3 adult breeding owls to the population every year to keep it viable to the point to where it's not going to crash at some point in time. So we took that number, 3 owls, and said, okay, if we extrapolate that out,
3 per site or 3 total?
3 total, yep. And you might think to yourself, well, 3 owls, that's kind of a funny number because 2 owls breed, and what's the other one going to do, right? But this is, on average, year after year, we'd like to add 3 adult breeding owls to the site. And so that's important for 2 reasons. One is we extrapolated that idea out and said, okay, well, what if that were true for the rest of the population that we don't have all this data on? And if we could assume that we have to add 3 owls every year over time for the population in its entirety, that seems like a reasonable assumption, based on the science that we're using here. So that's basically what we did. And so the graph, or the graph that I have in front of you here, basically is saying, if all things being equal, and if we really added 3 owls a year, just 3 owls every year, and we had this, this perfect line increasing over time, we started with about 70 adults. Back when this all was being done, about 2008, 2009, 70 adults in the whole sort of South Bay area. If we added 3 owls over time, we're going to end up with, somewhere in the neighborhood of 220 some odd owls. And we use that number that then kind of think about, okay, well, how much land would we need to support that? And that's really how we went about constructing the conservation strategy for the species in terms of how many acres of burrowing owl habitat do we need to have. And we came up with a couple of numbers here. One is that because of the limitations on where the species is in the study area, we have a limit on how many acres of breeding habitat can be lost to covered activities over time. And it's about 200 acres. And again, that's based on the fact that really there aren't that many places where there are owls inside of the study area now. Now, that doesn't count for potential habitat where there's not any owls, but it looks pretty good for them. We can lose that habitat. We're talking about the occupied habitat where there's nesting owls. And that became the basis for how we're going to collect fees to fund the conservation strategy over time. And knowing that we're going to lose about that many acres, we then, thinking about the 220 owls that we hope to have over a 50-year period, we started thinking about how many acres does an average burrowing owl, pair of burrowing owls use, and if you have 220 pair, how many acres are you going to need in the South Bay area to support them? And that's basically when I always say, like, well, where do those numbers come from? That's kind of where the numbers came from. So we have a little bit of data on how much area a pair of burrowing owls uses. We made some assumptions about how much of that total population is the responsibility of the habitat agency to protect and manage over time. It's not all our responsibility. There's other local jurisdictions that are outside of our plan area that have their own owls to worry about. And we came up with the fact that we want to over time protect 600 acres of burrowing owl habitat in perpetuity under easements or whatever. And then we want to have another several thousand acres under some sort of short-term management agreement. So that means it's not under a permanent easement, but we're entering into an agreement for a short period of time, probably on the order of 5 or 10 years, where the Habitat Agency is helping to fund management activities, things as innocuous as mowing or maybe predator control, putting up fences, things that you need to do to make a place better for burrowing owls, which isn't too much. We want to have these several thousand acres under some sort of short-term agreement so that funds can be put towards management for burrowing owls. This is the only species out of all of our covered species where we have this more, kind of flexible temporary management agreement idea. Everything else, all the other reserve lands are going to be protected in perpetuity, forever. Owl, because of the limitations on where they are and the fact that right now, at least, they're all in some of the most expensive real estate in the country, we knew that if we really wanted to commit to buying a whole bunch of acres up there, that would way outstrip our budget in the planning process. So we had to get creative. Luckily, the resource agencies let us get creative, and that's where we came up with this short-term management agreement idea. And we'll talk about a specific example that we're going to do at Don Edwards at the end of the presentation. I'm going to skip forward here just a little bit, not get too down into the weeds on the numbers. So as we then look at the kind of conservation strategy, it's twofold. One is we still need to avoid and minimize owls when they're occurring on a potential construction site or whatever. So we have a condition in the plan that basically says if you're going out and doing construction on a site and there are owls there are certain things you have to do. So you have this really nice looking flow chart that you have to kind of work through. The idea there was to keep the strategy as flexible as we could for areas where there are owls on construction sites, and actually give the cities the ability to still implement projects on properties where there actually were owls. This isn't going to come up very often, but it will in a few places. So there's a process that you have to go through if you have a property that has owls on it and you want to develop it, for example. Once you've avoided and minimized, then you really have to go into this somewhat complex conservation strategy that we've developed. So there's 3 tiers to the conservation strategy for burrowing owls. Trust me that the conservation strategy for every other species is not this complex. It had to be this way for owls for a number of reasons. Tier 1 is makes pretty much common sense. It simply is that we want to protect the owls where they are. We want to focus on areas where there are burrowing owls and have been burrowing owls nesting for a number of years, and put some of our funding into those areas to try and boost the numbers. So, do conservation where we have owls. Tier 2 is then thinking, okay, if we have the population pretty much secured where we have it and it's viable and it's doing well, then we want to start looking at some adjacent lands and some other areas that have high potential to support owls and start managing those lands to try and attract owls to different areas. So we aren't confined with just this handful of sites that have burrowing owls. We want to expand the distribution of the species within the study area. So that's kind of the Tier 2 idea. And then Tier 3 is a more active recovery action. So there's a lot of worry, and I think it's well-founded that our local population of owls is it's in dire straits right now. I mean, we just have a few sites, just a few owls, and any given year we could see a crash in the population and they could be gone locally. So Tier 3 is really aimed at doing things to actively recover the species. So things like doing some captive breeding activities to add more owls to areas where they currently are not currently persisting. Maybe moving owls around. So if we have a really healthy population, if we can maybe take some of those owls and put them in areas where there currently aren't owls, to expand the population a little bit. This is stuff that has happened a lot for other species, other bird species in particular, but it's something that has really been sort of rejected as an idea for burrowing owls, at least in California, for a long time. And the answer, when asked, the answer from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has always been, well, we're not convinced that we're at that point where we need to start doing these sort of a little bit more risky, crazy things. So this entire strategy was kind of constructed to demonstrate whether or not we're at that point. And then if we are at that point, we have this suite of Tier 3 conservation actions that we can deploy and start funding to actively recover the species, to prevent local extinction, essentially. So it sounds complex and it's somewhat convoluted, but there is a sort of method to the madness here. So I'll buzz through these things here pretty quickly. So just to say, currently what I'm going to talk about tonight later with respect to like what's happening at the Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge and ideas we have about other sites like the water pollution control plant and other things, those are all very much tier 1 conservation actions, right? So there's places where we have owls. They're doing pretty well, but there are some things that could happen on those sites to manage the habitat better, to kind of level out funding sources over time to make sure that things are managed every year, managed well every year. And what we're hoping to do is to boost the number of owls on those sites so that we can then think about tier 2 conservation actions, which are how do we get the owls to expand to these other areas. So we're very much in kind of a tier 1 situation right now. So implicit in all of this is us knowing every year how many owls do we have. We have these goals to increase the population a certain amount over time. We have to know where they are. So we created what we call the South Bay Burrowing Owl Survey Network, which sounds fancier than it really is. But there have been a lot of people in all these different places surveying for owls for various reasons for a long time. And what we're trying to do here, and this comes straight out of the habitat plan, is do a little bit more coordination between those groups and benefit from all of the work that they're already doing on their sites for whatever reason, and pull that information in and make it available to the habitat plan to kind of drive the conservation planning. So the network is made up of, ICF is sort of leading that effort right now. The Audubon Society is playing a key role, the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory, and Don Edwards, which again we'll talk about in a little bit. City of San Jose, in coordination with the Audubon Society, they've been doing a lot of work out at the water pollution control plant already, and so they've been involved from that angle. NASA Ames Moffett Airfield, they've been monitoring owls out there for, like I said, about 15 years, and so they've happily agreed to give us their data and participate in the process and use the methods that we're talking about to monitor the birds on their property. The same with the city of Mountain View on the Shoreline Golf Course, and then San Jose International Airport also, they've been collecting data out there for a number of years, up over 20 years now. So we've met with them a few times, and they're involved in this sort of survey effort as well. And this is what it basically looks like. So we actually just had a meeting this morning of this kind of like resource group, this Burrowing Owl resource group that involves a lot of these parties that are doing the surveys. And this is year 1 of the survey effort. And the goal was to survey as much of these areas that have occupied burrowing owl habitat as possible. And this is what the kind of survey coverage looks like there. So the boxes are just, again, nothing special about the boxes except to say that when we were coordinating the effort, we were, like you're responsible for box 6 and you're responsible for box 7, and just make sure that there wasn't any overlap, so that we were efficient. And then looking not just at the habitat that's occupied or that we know has owls, but then looking within those boxes at habitat that's not occupied, or at least that we know of, but that maybe could be. So again, starting to prioritize areas that we want to look at for these management agreements over time. So that's what the survey effort looked like. You'll notice it was very focused on the North San Jose, Mountain View, around the Fremont area. That was primarily kind of a funding constraint. Being year 1, not knowing really what it's going to take to coordinate the effort and how much ground we can cover. We allocated a certain amount of funding towards it, and we said, okay, how much can we do for that amount of funding? And that's what we did. Going forward, we'll probably expand that survey effort down the valley and certainly down around the Pajaro area where there are some owls historically. So over time, we'll be covering more ground, but that was kind of where we were this year. Here's some preliminary results. These are actually changing in real time because, as I said, we met with the group earlier today, and we already have some edits to this. So take these numbers with a grain of salt, but just to say that this is kind of the ballpark. And you can kind of see the distribution there. The highlights are the areas with the most owls. This is not unusual. Is at San Jose Airport. Owls love San Jose Airport, and they have for a long time, for better or worse. Same with Moffett Airfield. That's the 2 places where we have the most owls, and we're then interestingly kind of constrained because they're airports, and you don't manage for species on airports. People who fly airplanes don't like that very much. And so at San Jose and at Moffett, they've actually been able to manage for owls, keep them out of the active runway areas, in areas where they're not causing concern for aircraft coming in and out, et cetera, and have been able to allow populations to persist in those locations. And seems like, unless something changes drastically, that is going to persist over time. So it puts the Habitat Agency in a little bit of a tricky spot because we're, in essence, kind of relying on those populations because we want them to seed our other populations. But we have to be a little bit careful about how we talk about, managing for species on airports. And so we have ongoing conversations with both of those entities to get guarantees that they're going to continue to do what they do without getting them in trouble with, with the FAA, essentially. So that's kind of where we are. In the grand scheme of things, I don't have a slide in here that really talks about the history of this, but in the grand scheme of things, just thinking about the number of breeding adults, we're actually currently up a little bit than above where we were maybe a few years ago. Certainly more owls on this slide than what I talked about we had in like 2009. That could be for a number of reasons. Certainly there's not like some burrowing owl boom going on right now, but the numbers at each of the individual sites seem to be up, with a couple of exceptions. They're actually down in Mountain View, for example. But also maybe just be the fact that there are more people out looking for them in a more coordinated way. So we're actually getting pretty good survey coverage for the owls now. In the past, it was somewhat haphazard. In some places it was really great, other places it wasn't. And so the numbers that we had were reflective of that. We maybe didn't have a great picture of what the actual population was. So I feel like we're getting closer to having a pretty good handle on what the actual population looks like. And so you can kind of think about 107 owls and where that falls on this graph. And it's actually going to be more than 107 by the time it's all tallied. But then that's year one. And then we have to think about, okay, we need to add 3 owls next year and 3 owls the year after that. So obviously the population is probably going to cycle naturally over time. But in general, we want to keep this upward trend. And that's going to come from managing them better where they are, finding new places for them to inhabit, and so forth. And so that's the goal. The actual goal in the habitat plan is to increase the population by 3 owls over time. So that's the metric that we're managing for and monitoring against, and that's why we have to do these annual surveys. So I mentioned kind of key accomplishments. Utilizing this regional approach, it's a bit of a no-brainer. It's kind of funny, as important as burrowing owls have been in the South Bay area, for a number of years. I use the word important in a number of ways. They're always sort of at the top of people's conscience when it comes to CEQA projects and so forth. There's never really been as coordinated as an effort as there is now, which is kind of interesting, but it comes down to, there was just never money to do that, and now the Habitat Agency can sort of fulfill that role. And we're seeing, I think, a lot of benefit just sitting around the table with the group in the resource group in the survey network. We're seeing a lot of benefit to just those day-to-day interactions. And so I think that's the kind of thing that you don't really ever think about with respect to the habitat plan and the creation of the Habitat Agency, that you can sort of have an entity that can do those coordination efforts that really give you a lot of value. So what are we going to do for the next 5 years? So here's kind of the key issues as I see them. One of the realities, again, a thing that makes burrowing owls different than our other covered species, is that most of our allowed burrowing owl habitat loss is actually probably going to happen in the next 5 years, certainly within the next 10 years. That's just the reality of the fact that the owls are, inhabiting these areas that are highly coveted for development. We're in the midst of another, building boom in the South Bay area or in the Bay Area in general, and so we're probably going to incur all of our loss of burrowing owl habitat in a very short period of time. That's different than what's going to happen for all of our other species, where it's just going to be pretty gradual over the 45 or 50 years. So that gives us 2 issues to think about. One is we have to make sure that we protect and stabilize the population so that as we lose that habitat in a short period of time, we don't lose our owls and then undercut our entire conservation strategy. So that's one issue. The other issue is nearly all of our funding for our burrowing owl conservation strategy is going to come in the door in the first 10 years. And we have to be careful about how we spend that money, because we have to spend it over the course of 50 years. So I think that's something for this group to sort of grapple with, and other bodies related to the Habitat Agency grapple with, is just making sure that as that money comes in, that we're doing everything that we can with it to make sure that we're, implementing the conservation strategy, but that we aren't short-sighted in the fact that as we begin to acquire properties and enter into management agreements, we have to make that stretch over a period of time. And so that's just a reality of where the birds are and where the development's going to happen. Another key thing that we didn't contemplate when we wrote the strategy was dealing with burrowing owl impacts outside of the study area. And we obviously knew that that would have implications on our ability to continue to conserve the species inside of the study area. But, burrowing owl, assessing impacts to burrowing owls for projects is done purely through the CEQA process. It's not a listed species, so there's no state or federal permits that are issued for it. And so for other local jurisdictions, other cities or other entities that are doing projects that are going to be impacting burrowing owls or their habitat, any commitments that they make to protecting the species is going to be done through CEQA. And so, we have to kind of grapple with what is the role of the Habitat Agency in that process. The Habitat Agency has an interest in making sure that burrowing owls are at least managed for as part of the CEQA process, because we don't, again, want it to undercut our conservation strategy. So we have to think about that. What's the role of the Habitat Agency in CEQA processes in other jurisdictions that are not subject to the plan? And then also the ability of the agency to accept mitigation money from those other CEQA projects that we could then use for mitigation projects or conservation projects for the owl. Because one of the things that we're seeing, or a trend that we're seeing, is as CEQA plays out on a project in Mountain View or Fremont or whatever, the one thing that we hear a lot is, well, whatever you do, it should be consistent with the burrowing owl conservation strategy in the Santa Clara Valley Habitat Plan. Number one, we don't really know what that means. It could mean a lot of things. And then number two, oftentimes those local jurisdictions are like, well, can't we just pay the fee? Can't we just somehow opt into this thing? And that's not that easy of a question, right? And so the other time that this has come up is with nitrogen deposition fees, where there's other entities outside of our study area that are grappling with nitrogen deposition, and they're like, well, can't we just sort of buy our way in? And maybe they can, and that's just something that we're sorting out. And so that's, again, something for this group to think about. Certainly makes a lot of sense to have all of money from other places come through the Habitat Agency and to then implement burrowing owl conservation in a coordinated way. That makes a lot of sense to me. But it's probably not as easy as it sounds. So, and then one of the main components of the strategy that we talk about in the plan is utilizing other things like landfills or other land uses, maybe golf courses, things where burrowing owls might be hanging out anyway, and working with those, either the local landfill manager or maybe even Cal Recycle at more of a programmatic level, to pull places like that into our short-term management agreements and our reserve system. Again, makes a lot of sense, but not as easy as it might sound when you start talking with Cal Recycle, and they're like, well, actually, we don't necessarily want burrowing owls and ground squirrels and other things running around on our landfills all the time. So we're just in the early stages of those discussions, and there's been some recent successes, not with respect to the Habitat Agency, but with other local jurisdictions in Mountain View and Sunnyvale and others. So we're kind of wading into that arena as well. And then initiating these studies on active recovery techniques. So the stuff I mentioned about, doing things to actively grow more owls so we can put them in new places, that's all very experimental. It's pretty high-risk stuff, which is why the Department of Fish and Wildlife has always been nervous about it. So as we do it, we have to make sure that it's done in a very sort of methodic and scientifically based way. And so, we'll be starting up some of that work probably next year, working with some local experts. And it's going to be slow going. It's not just that we can't just go out next year and say, we're going to foster a bunch of owl chicks in a recovery facility somewhere and then put them out on the ground. That's a pretty big chance of failure if we do it that way. So it's going to be very sort of regimented over time, and you'll be hearing probably updates on that over the course of the next year. So that's, I think that kind of comes to the end. I think I'll save the rest of the discussion for the next item on the agenda, which is this idea of these management agreements. So is there any questions at this point in time? Anything to add?
Okay. Okay.
Oh, I wasn't sure if it was on or not. Two questions. On the budgeting, when money comes in for the burrowing owl mitigation, is it a one-for-one? That money has to be spent on the owl and no other monies? Is that the way that works?
The burrowing owl fees have to be spent. So there's a separate fee for impacts to burrowing owl breeding and foraging habitat associated with those nesting breeding areas. And that is around $55,000 an acre. And that money has to be spent on burrowing owl. There's land cover fees that are also collected on those same properties. Those can be spent a little more flexibly. But anything that's specifically earmarked as a fee for burrowing owl has to be spent on burrowing owl mitigation.
The second part of that is, could funds from other places be used if it were needed?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So
Yes.
it's not restricted just to
Yes.
that.
Like some of the lands that potentially could be burrowing owl habitat could be purchased with those land cover fee dollars. They wouldn't have to be purchased with the burrowing owl specific fee mitigation monies.
Okay.
And we can also use grants, and if we're lucky enough, get money from foundations. So there are other potential sources that could help with the birds.
And then the other question is on the owls themselves. What is the general population of the burrowing owls in the rest of the Bay Area? Further up the peninsula, East Bay and the North Bay, what's going on with that, just real briefly?
There aren't many. So historically, there always were a few owls sprinkled around in western Alameda County and in Contra Costa County, and then even a few up in Sonoma and Napa, Solano County as well. But over the years, actually now the kind of, I don't know if I want to use the word stronghold, but the stronghold in the Bay Area for burrowing owls is now in the South Bay.
Oh, okay.
So
That's what I was trying to
there
find
aren't
out.
very many owls left. And then as you go up the East Bay, there's a little bit of a difference there because there are burrowing owls out in like eastern Alameda County and eastern Contra Costa County. But they're not a different species, but they're behaving a lot differently than the owls that we have that are kind of ringed right around the bay. So there's that to consider too. I mean, there's a lot of, as you go over the shoulder of Altamont and get down into, well, in Altamont itself, and then as you get down into, that kind of shoulder before you get down into the Central Valley, there are lots of owls out there, but they behave pretty differently than these sort of more urbanized owls that we have.
Okay.
Yeah.
And following up on that, elsewhere in California?
Similar issue. So, it's always been kind of interesting because the owls that we deal with in the Bay Area have been in this kind of like situation of dire straits for a while. They've been getting hemmed in by development and other things. Around the state, that's true in other places, but by and large, amazingly, somehow, the burrowing owl population has remained somewhat stable. Now, this information comes out of a couple of years ago. It's been probably like 4 years ago now. There was a petition to list the species as a state under the State Endangered Species Act, and the finding from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife at the time was they declined the listing on the data that the burrowing owl population statewide was actually relatively stable, knowing that there were local situations like in the Bay Area where there's clearly a problem. One of the things that's been boosting those populations for a number of years now across the state is that down in the Imperial Valley, there's a really big population of burrowing owls that are taking advantage of the kind of agricultural setting down in the valley, using the levees and berms that are built around in the Imperial Valley. Even that population now has gone down a little bit, but I've always thought it was kind of interesting to know that if water in California becomes so restricted that the Imperial Valley doesn't get as much water as it is now and has in the past, actually burrowing owls could suffer from lack of water as much as many other species. That's kind of an interesting thing. So it's like, I've always kind of thought of it as being a little bit of a, like a false situation, because that population of burrowing owls is boosting the statewide numbers a little bit, but it's in a pretty artificial setting. So I don't know if I answered the question, but
No. Okay, other questions?
I have
comments?
one. you concluded that in the next 5 years, we're going to probably lose all our habitat area. And yet, more than half the owls are at the airport, 2 airports.
Yeah.
And we're not going to use those airports. So how are we going to lose it all if, in fact, we're going to keep the airports, I would assume?
Yeah, and maybe I misspoke. What I was saying was we're not going to lose it all, but of the, we're basically allowed to impact, there's a cap. So the state wanted a cap on the number of acres of nesting habitat that could be lost, and that cap is 198 acres. So that 198 acres is going to be chewed up probably over the next 5 years, certainly within the next 10 years.
But those acres are not within the 2 airports that we're talking
That's
about.
correct. That's correct. Yeah, exactly. Right. So the airport will be there. I mean, all those other areas will still be there. But, some of just think about a couple of examples where there are some parcels adjacent to the airport where owls use those areas. They certainly forage in those areas, but they're zoned for, development, and they'll probably be developed over time. So.
Okay, other questions from members?
I have a question. Isn't it mainly management too? Because if it's tall grass, they really don't like those areas. So that's why they like the airports, because it's always mowed.
Absolutely.
And maybe a ranch where it's grazed with a cow might work out too.
Yep, absolutely, yeah. And what I'll talk about next is some of the types of management that can be done or are being done in many cases to make places better for owls. And interestingly, even though the habitat's pretty restricted, they're pretty easy species to manage for relative to other things, right? It's not like you're doing a wetland restoration, which is much more intensive. You just have to make sure that the grass is short at the right time of the year, make sure that there's, ground squirrel, plenty of burrows, and make sure that there's something for them to eat out there as well, so that there's a prey base. So it's not a crazy species to manage for, but you have to do it, and it doesn't happen.
But they don't eat the ground squirrels. They just use their burrows.
That's
and
correct.
then they eat mice and stuff.
Yeah, mice, insects, lizards, things like that. Yeah. Yep.
Questions?
Just 2 questions. One, you were mentioning funding earlier for the South Bay Burrowing Owl Network. I'm just wondering where the funding was coming from.
From the Habitat Agency.
It is from
Yep.
the Habitat Agency.
So
okay.
the funding to kind of coordinate the effort and to do a little bit of the surveying came from the Habitat Agency. A lot of those other entities, they're already surveying for owls for their own purposes, the airport and Moffett and Mountain View. So they were just sort of going about business as usual. They have their staff consultants or whatever that are doing that for them. So the Habitat Agency, for example, wasn't funding the monitoring and management at the airport, just the coordination effort to collect the data. So.
Okay. And the other question, so I guess it's a question. So you were talking about the Habitat Agency's role in CEQA with the non-permittee jurisdictions. And I'm just wondering, are we sort of taking a reactive approach? Is that what we're thinking right now, or is that sort of the mode we're in versus proactive in the sense of we're waiting for development decisions to be made and then we'll sort of weigh in? Are we having any sort of upfront discussions with the jurisdictions?
I would say it's a combination of both. I'd say this management agreement with Don Edwards represents a proactive approach. We're going to talk to the city about the sewage treatment plant area and the landfill areas San Jose, sorry. And so I would view those as proactive. The waiting for development to come and the fees to be collective, that's definitely reactive. The habitat will be impacted, but hopefully some of these management agreements will offset some of the impacts of development on these foraging and nesting sites.
So, for instance, if Mountain View, and it seems that there's a real interest now with the new council to maybe move forward with North Bay Shore, we would sort of just take a wait-and-see position to see what the council does, or would we engage them at an earlier point?
Yeah, you're talking about the North Bay Precision Plan. Yeah, that's not going to affect burrowing owls, believe it or not. It's all. Yes, it is going to be close. Right. Yeah. Yes. So there'll be the sort of indirect impacts of feral cats that'll result from that development. Yeah. But yeah, so we commented on that project for nitrogen because they were claiming that the plan was going to solve all their nitrogen issues, and we said we disagree. So, but with the city of Santa Clara, Troy alluded to, we did write a couple comment letters to some of their big projects coming up, saying your project, we're part of a global community here trying to deal with this issue. You can't ignore it. What you're doing could affect the ability to implement the strategy. So that's sort of how we're being proactive too, by the non-participating cities, as we would call them, making them recognize the issue. But with the precision plan, there wasn't a direct impact on the owls. We looked into it, but yeah, there'll definitely be an indirect impact. Yeah.
Okay. Sort of an aside of what you're mentioning, because you're mentioning submitting comment letters. Is there a way for us to receive those comment letters to sort of stay up to date on what the agency is putting out there? That'd be great.
Sure. I could send you guys copies of the.
Okay.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
And do we have any comments from anyone in the audience on what we've covered so far? Okay,
I have
oh,
one
go
more
ahead.
question. Yeah. So I know, Troy, you talked earlier about you're just looking for nesting sites, but I know in the wintertime there's a lot of foraging sites, especially on Coyote Ridge and areas. Is that taken into account at all, or are those data points just not even considered?
Well, it's taken into account in that it helps us gain a better understanding of how owls are using all of the habitat in the South Bay area. It's not part of our survey effort right now. There are some other studies outside of the habitat plan going on, just getting off the ground, looking at how owls are moving around in the wintertime. That is certainly going to feed into some of our decision making at some point in time, and there certainly could be a point in the future where the Habitat Agency gets involved at funding some work looking at overwintering habitat. We could expand our survey effort to start looking in the wintertime for owls and looking at sites that they're using. Just right now we're focused on where the owls are, where they're nesting, and trying to get a handle on what's happening there. Assuming, and this could be wrong, but assuming that overwintering habitat, at least at this point in time, isn't a limiting factor for the species. So that's kind of where we are.
Okay,
Yep.
Thanks.
Might our area be unique enough where what's going on here is not replicated elsewhere? Because I'm just thinking that maybe we can steal from what is going on elsewhere, but am I hearing you say that we are fairly, if not greatly, unique?
Yeah, that's true. The one and some of the stuff some of the information that's in the conservation strategy is stolen from some places like Florida, where they had a very similar situation in Florida back in the 90s, where they were going through this multi-decade transition. If you think about the South Bay area, where it went from an agricultural setting, one that wasn't very conducive to burrowing owls, at least from orchards and whatnot. But the bay itself was pretty much grassland, and then that very quickly has transitioned to an urban setting. And so as that area sort of got cleared and leveled and flattened, and some of it was developed, but some of it was left kind of fallow, if you will, for a while. That's the kind of situation that the same thing kind of happened in Florida, and they had a kind of a boom in a burrowing owl population for a short period of time. And then, unfortunately, over time, it was all eventually built over as planned, and the owls are gone. And so when we were looking at this strategy, back in 2006, 7, 8, we were kind of trying to take some lessons from that and thinking like, okay, we don't want that to happen here. We certainly have seen the effects of development over time, because there used to be many more owls in the area, and there still are a good number, but they're now smushed into these little tiny areas, and the foraging habitat over time has been, just death by 1,000 paper cuts, and so it is unique in that regard to have this urban of a population of burrowing owls, and I think the other thing that makes it really unique is trying to contemplate doing conservation for a species on land that is so expensive. You really have to get creative in how you spend your money in that case. So.
And one other, the increasing the foraging area, which would seem key to this whole thing with the drought. And then further with the drought, I know that at Gavilan, we've had to basically pause environmental impact reports because we're in such a not traditional, ongoing, we hope, thing. And so that we can't move forward on stuff because we're into a major drought. So how's that going to, are we maybe tilting at windmills with right now anyway?
It's possible. It's hard to know in any given year, how a population is responding to certain sort of current weather patterns or rain patterns or whatever. I was surprised when all the numbers came in. I was surprised that the numbers for owls were as high as they were right now, because my original thought was, for a species that relies on amphibians and insects and things like that, it seems like persistent drought would be a big problem for them. It probably is in many ways, but I was surprised to see where the numbers are now. Next year, who knows, right? I mean, they're a boom and bust population, so they could be way down next year. There could be other factors. Certainly the things like drought and even years of high rainfall or late rainfall, like changes in when the rain hits the ground, certainly would have impacts on a ground nesting species like this. But I think it's really hard to kind of tie specifics to it. So.
Okay. And then if we could move on to the second part.
Yeah.
Number 4.
So I mentioned that we're very much in kind of tier 1 of our conservation strategy. So we're looking at areas that have owls and thinking about how can we make them better and by association then sort of grow more owls in those areas. And I mentioned the unique thing that we have in the conservation strategy that allows us to enter into these short-term management agreements. And the idea behind this is to figure out a way to funnel some of this conservation money to private or public landowners to help them sort of offset the costs of what it would take to do better management for burrowing owls. And so, it's really, in most cases, except for if you're an airport, it's really not in your interest to really worry too much about going out and mowing grass, every year to make sure that it's short for burrowing owl breeding season, or to make sure that you trap out all the feral cats, or that you don't have, whatever. It's not. We're trying to create an incentive here for those landowners to do that, and that incentive is that we can say, tell us what you need to have happen out there, and if you're resource constrained, maybe the Habitat Agency can step in and provide some funding. So that's what we're doing now. We have basically, there's no limit to who could participate in these management agreements. There are some guidelines in the plan itself based on where the owls are and what the suitability of the habitat is that helps kind of guide us gives us some guidance on where to look for potential interested parties. But we're starting with somewhat low-hanging fruit and looking at some of the public agencies around and looking at their land ownership and seeing if there are things that they can do on their properties to manage for owls in a better way. And so the 3 that are shown there on the slide, Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge, the San Jose International Airport, and the Water Pollution Control Plan are kind of the 3 on the top of the list at this point in time. I'm going to go into detail about the National Wildlife Refuge in a sec, but I'll just quickly touch on the airport and the Water Pollution Control Plant. So the airport, we're not talking about the airport itself, but there are lands adjacent to the airport, south of the airport specifically, that are city-owned lands. They have many other uses happening on them right now. It's an area that the airport and their staff that manage and monitor for burrowing owls have been interested in for a number of years, doing something out there. We're not talking about a little land. It's just a small amount of land, but they are looking for some funding to do to expand their monitoring to those areas, to maybe do some fencing out there, do some mowing. Again, it's not rocket science. And so we haven't entered into an agreement with them, but we had a couple of meetings with them, and we're kind of probably in the coming months, then we'll start sorting out the details on that. And then at San Jose,
Are you talking about the Guadalupe Gardens area?
Yes.
Oh.
Yep. Yep.
Cool.
And not the entire thing, because there's lots of other, we're not going to pull out the rose garden. Don't worry, it'll be fine. No, I know, but there are a lot of interests out there, and there's a lot of people doing things out there, and so, but there are parts of it that we think could be made a little bit better for owls. On the water pollution control plant, for a couple of years now, they've been doing some management on the kind of west half of what's known as the bufferlands out there, working with the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society, managing the habitat pretty actively for owls. So artificial burrows, creating some brush piles, putting in berms, doing things out there that make it more hospitable for owls. And they've seen a pretty interesting increase in the number of owls. There's always been owls out there historically, but this is the first time that they've ever really been focused on managing the habitat for owls, and they're seeing pretty good returns on that. The Habitat Agency hasn't entered into an agreement with the city on that site yet, but that's coming, I think. So they've noted that they're interested. They have funding basically to continue what they're doing for another couple of years, but then funding is uncertain at that point in time, and so we'll probably be talking to them about expanding that and extending it over time. So that's to come. Nothing concrete happening on that yet. The one place where we have some activity is on...
Real quickly?
Yep, sorry.
You say there's been interesting results. What exactly? I mean, from the start point to what? Does Josh know that?
Josh can come up and speak to that way better than I can. Is that okay?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So historically, from
If you could introduce yourself for the record.
my name is Josh Bukleski. I'm the Burning Out Project Manager with Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society. So I think out at, when it was Arzino's Ranch, historically what we saw was about 3 to 5 owls. Historically, I have some rough data from Audubon members that have been out there. This year, we had 7 adults, we had 6 pairs. All the pairs were successful, and out of those 6 pairs, we ended up with 27 chicks. So the breeding success was really high, very productive. I think the average in the Bay Area is about 3 chicks per clutch, and we almost hit 6. So all the pairs are really productive this year. So we're seeing some really good results. So
Great. Thanks, Josh.
So some specifics about what's happening at Don Edwards, and actually we have Kat Burns, the executive director of the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory, and Idona Kokoros, an ecologist for the Bird Observatory, who can come up and address some of your specific questions if you have them. I'm just going to give kind of an overview of what's happening out there and the Habitat Agency's role and how that's going to play out over time. But you know, I just sort of pretend to be a biologist, so that we actually have the people who know what they're doing here if you have real questions.
Real biologist.
Yeah. So again, looking at the map, thinking about our study area, and I showed you before, but the area that we're talking about with respect to Don Edwards. So Don Edwards actually, kind of rings the whole bay here, but their Warm Springs unit is up here, kind of in the Fremont area, so up in the East Bay, almost getting up into the East Bay, I guess, but certainly within our expanded burrowing owl study area. And a site that was identified in the habitat plan as being a site that could be important for owls, and we very much, it's no accident, I guess, that we're now working with them on this, because it was something that we've been thinking about for a long time. Here's a kind of a closer look at the refuge itself, and then the Warm Springs unit is this kind of reddish or pinkish area over here. So it's a little over 700 acres. Taking yet a closer look, a little over 700 acres. It's actually a vernal pool grassland out there. So maybe not this year, but in most years when there's decent moisture, there's vernal pools out there. There's listed species that use those vernal pools: California tiger salamanders, vernal pool tadpole shrimp, things like that. There's also historically always been burrowing owls out there, and the management has changed over the years. It's a grazed area, and the management's changed over the years for various reasons. And historically there have been a large number of owls up in the 60s. See, that's why I brought them. So yeah, so up over 60 adults, and it's been low too in years where the grass is too tall and it hasn't been managed as appropriately. So certainly an area that that is interesting regionally for the species, and a place that we thought would be worth investing some resources. Interestingly, when we wrote the idea into the habitat plan years ago, like, hey, we should go do this, with the refuge, we actually didn't even talk to them before we put that in the plan. Mostly because I didn't want to hear them say no, because I didn't really know what they were going to say. But we went and talked to them earlier in the year, and they're super excited about the concept. Like every federal agency, they're often, resource constrained and would love to do more things on their property given the given the people and the funding. And so I think what we're seeing here is an opportunity for some real dual benefit from their perspective. So they're managing for the listed species, the salamanders and the shrimp that I talked about. We're interested in burrowing owls. They are too, but they don't get as much funding attached to species that aren't listed. So we can kind of fill a gap there from their perspective. And so what basically has happened now, and here's just a couple of pictures of some work that they've been doing out here now. The Bird Observatory and others, refuge staff, did a pilot project this last year looking at grassland management sort of holistically, so looking at weed control and transitioning it to kind of a more native grassland, and looking at how can we make the habitat better for burrowing owls. So again, kind of a holistic approach here, and have seen some great results again. So no surprise, you have an area just like Josh explained at the water pollution control plant, where you have a few owls kind of hanging out over the course of time, and then you start managing in a targeted way for it, and you see the numbers start to come up very quickly. I wanted to include these pictures for two reasons. One, to show you that SFBBO and the refuge were able to get a huge volunteer group to go out and do a lot of the work. Audubon Society actually been using a lot of volunteers on the water pollution control plant project as well. So this again has kind of a dual purpose. It's great for the species and is helping us implement our strategy. Also has a great sort of public outreach benefit as well, getting the public involved in the management of the species. And so you see people out there digging artificial burrows and doing other things. And then I also want to show this picture of the owl, because most of the time in my presentations I show you cute pictures of owls that are in perfect focus and zoomed in. But in reality, when you're out looking at burrowing owls, this is pretty much what you see. Usually they're pretty far away, and there's some heat waves, and you're trying to kind of figure it out. So I thought I'd be a little more realistic today and show you an actual field picture of a burrowing owl. And so the plan is, so they did a pilot study this last year, had some great success, and so put together a proposal to basically expand and continue that effort for the next 5 years. So this is going to be a 5-year agreement between the Habitat Agency and the Refuge and SFBBO to basically continue doing what they were doing this year. So managing the grassland habitat, keeping it short for owls, implementing some systematic surveys for the species. So in here you'll notice, Craig, not just nesting surveys, but also looking to see how the birds are using the habitats during the wintertime. And to determine, are they staying, are they wintering and staying for the nesting season, or are they part of a migratory population or what have you. Continuing the vegetation management, looking at ways to enhance the prey base, so putting some rock piles out there, some vegetative islands to create really good habitat for things like small mammals and lizards and insects, things that will keep owls happy during the nesting and wintering season. And then one of the more important things is implementing a predator control program. So they already do, at the refuge, they already do predator control on a lot of the refuge, mostly focused around their Western Snowy Plover Recovery Program. So in essence, this is kind of just expanding that. So they have a feral cat problem. Who doesn't have a feral cat problem? They have a feral cat problem out there. So the idea here is to kind of expand their contract with the USDA to more actively control feral cats out there, which are no doubt having an effect on the nesting burrowing owls. They're probably, it's not proposed at this point in time, but it certainly is conceivable to see us maybe looking at doing some fencing of some of those areas out there to see if we can't, stabilize the habitat. There's not a huge human presence out there like there might be in other places, just because it's kind of off the beaten path. But humans can have an impact on species too, like this, because they're a ground nesting bird. So that's basically it. I mean, it's a bit of a broken record because I keep telling you, well, we're going to mow and we're going to control cats and we're going to, provide habitat for a prey base, but that's pretty much what you do for burrowing owls across the board here. So it's not like we're reinventing the wheel necessarily. So the idea is, as I mentioned, this will be initially a 5-year effort. The 5-year term is really more driven by the refuge system than by anything that we're interested in. We would love to enter into a 50-year agreement with them, obviously, but if we keep it at 5 years, they can make those decisions locally and not have to send it to Washington, which they prefer to do, and we prefer that they do, just because it makes it easier on everybody. And so we're going to start with 5 years. Obviously, could have the ability to renew that if needed after that. and if things are going well. But that's basically the idea. So we would do something similar to this, with the city on the water pollution control plan, maybe on these adjacent airport lands. We could do the same thing with a private landowner up in that area that had habitat that was, somewhat suitable. And if they wanted to, enter into an agreement with the habitat agency where the agency could come in and help them manage their lands better for owls, it would be a very similar thing. Every agreement's going to look a little different because of the needs of the landowner. But by and large, the management's going to be very, very much the same. So that's what's happening at Don Edwards. And I don't know, see, there's that picture I was talking about. I don't know if, I just took that off of Wiki Commons. I can't take any credit for it. I don't know if you have any questions about what specifically was happening at Don Edwards, or any questions for Kat or Donna about what they found in the past year or what their plans are for the next year, but I think now would be a good time to talk about that.
If we could start, Ed, do you have anything you want to add?
No, just that we'd like some feedback from the group here. Any thoughts you would have, because this will go to the TAC on December 8th for approval, and then on to the implementation board in January 15th for final contract agreement.
Board members, our charge is to review the proposed scope of the work and to submit comments, feedback to the agency, other boards. So anyone who wants to start.
And it doesn't have to be today. You can provide written comment to us just by December 1st.
Okay.
So, but we're willing to take comments today, but but don't feel obligated. You have to do it today.
Jen?
Yeah, I had a kind of more general question back on the management plans, of which I think this is one example. So I was surprised a little bit. I mean, not, unpleasantly surprised, but the management that's described in this plan is pretty active in terms of finding burrows, and then right at those burrows, active burrows, doing specific vegetation management there. So when we've talked about the agreements that you're making with other entities, like for the airport, I forget, water pollution control plant, are they going to have a very similar flavor?
We hope so. Yes.
Yeah. So we're trying to get some uniformity.
Yes.
And actually more active.
Active management. There's some properties, parcels that are part of the complex out there that are currently not being managed very intensely. Mm-hmm. Ken Davies was telling me that today. So there's some areas where we could use our funds to assist them with more intensive management, and then some of the techniques that we'll employ here as we collect data, find out that they work. Mm-hmm. Hopefully they work, then they can be employed at these other sites.
So really the plan is to implement this kind of more aggressive management in as many areas as we can.
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Just to add to that, I think initially it could be that more active and intensive management tapers off over time too. If as the population, mm-hmm. We'll just kind of play it, right. Year to year. One of the tricks, in my view, to making these things work is attracting the owls there in the first place. We have to make it really hospitable at the right time of year so that they show up to nest. And part of that is what you're describing, the active management right around the burrows. Part of it is, making them as attractive as we can to it so they'll initiate nesting. And keep them clear over time so they can, being a ground nesting bird, they have to be able to see what's going on so they don't, get killed by a cat or something. It could be that we find over time that we can maybe shift resources away from that more active management to something else if we feel like it's, the population is stable. So very much an adaptive approach. So,
and just kind of a follow-up on the same area. I actually went back and looked at the strategy, and there were some tier 1 plans described, and a list of locations. And we've talked about some of those locations, but along with the tier 1, they were also looking specifically at like Mission College, Shoreline, Moffett, some VTA areas around North San Jose. and the Tesla plant in Fremont. Are we also actually pursuing right now the same types of agreements with those areas as well? Or have we really just focused on the, I think, 4 that we've mentioned tonight?
Yeah, well, the Tesla agreement, if I get an automobile from them, then we'll work into it. I haven't, Troy is better to answer that question. This is the first one I've been involved with. I don't think we've talked to the Tesla people yet, but I do know that some of those sites you mentioned, that they were at the meeting today, that we had people managing those sites. So I do foresee in the future that possibly there could be agreements with some of those entities also. And something else that we're going to start looking into, and Lynn Trulio mentioned it today, there's birds that are from outside the region who are overwintering here, and is there a way we could encourage them to stay? Some may be coming as far away as the Pacific Northwest. Nobody knows for sure where they're coming from, but they're probably not from the populations here. So is there a way to encourage some of those birds to stay, or some of the birds in our county to naturally relocate to some of those potential areas that Troy identified on that map? And if we can accomplish that, sort of enhancing some of the habitat in that area to make it more attractive for the birds to decide to take up residence there, is also a strategy that we got to start thinking hard about too. How to increase the population in areas that are not going to be under the same development pressure, where there's more room to roam and expand their range.
Or do we really want outside birds, almost like bringing in non-native plants?
Well, given they're the same species, they would add from a genetic diversity standpoint. Yeah, it'd be a good thing from a gene pool standpoint. Yeah, so in this case, not an issue. Other cases, sure. I mean, it's an issue with the salamanders breeding with hybridization, but with this would be a good thing. It would lead to more genetic diversity within the local population. Someone at the meeting today said in one of the populations, I don't know at what site, that there's some inbreeding going on. That's never too much inbreeding, which is not a good thing. We hear about it with cheetahs and other populations. It can lead to the decline of the species.
Well, I was in North Carolina for a while too.
Right.
Other comments? Go ahead.
In general, I'm very supportive of it. The money's there. We've got good SFBBO's got a great reputation for being able to handle that. So from that respect, I'm supportive of it. The one question I'm not clear on, and I'm a little concerned about, is the temporary protection of adjacent lands that you talked about. And I don't understand, maybe it's from the industry that I'm in, where it's permanent protection. Why are we spending money on temporary protection? Can you clarify that for me and exactly how that works? I don't get that.
Absolutely, yeah. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the only species where we have the flexibility to do that. The reason that we included that option in the conservation strategy for the burrowing owl was the simple fact that, number one, we knew we had to influence the burrowing owl population where it's currently located. We need more owls, and it just so happens that nearly all the owls are on public lands. Whether it be an airport or a refuge or a golf course right now. So we knew we weren't going to, for example, be able to go and get an easement on an airport or the refuge. So we had to figure out a mechanism that would allow us to put funding towards those populations, and we wanted to be able to get it under contract, for lack of a better term. So that was one reason for the flexibility. The other one was that we realized that we could go and probably buy lots of potential burrowing owl habitat down, in south of Gilroy, or maybe between Gilroy and San Martin or something, and never have any owls show up there over the course of 50 years. So we really need to focus our funding on the sort of North San Jose, around the South Bay region. And the only way that we can really do that, we simply can't afford to go and buy that land and put it under easement, or buy an easement on that land. Number one, people aren't going to sell a conservation easement on land that's, zoned for very high dollar development. And number two, we just couldn't afford it, even if they did, probably. So we had to come up with some other kind of creative strategy that would allow us to approach private landowners and say, hey, we don't want to buy your land or even get an easement on it, but if you don't have any plans for the next 5 or 10 years, maybe we could enter into a short-term agreement, give them some funding to, kind of creative an incentive for them to manage their parcel or parcels for burrowing owls, knowing that someday it might get developed. But in the meantime, we benefit from boosting the burrowing owl numbers, hoping that we can get them to move to other areas. When we were developing the strategy, we always, and I hope this isn't true, but we always kind of said, we feel like we have about 10 years to really make a difference with the burrowing owl population. And if we don't do something drastic in 10 years, we might be in real trouble with, we might lose the local burrowing owl population. And so all of these things are an attempt to find creative ways to get money where it needs to be now, hoping that we can then, over 20, 30, 40 years, have enough owls that we can get them to expand into these other cheaper areas.
Because it seems to me, and I hope that you plan for it, that if the success of the owls over the next 10 years is because of these temporary lands and then they go away,
right?
What have you accomplished? Because then the population crashes, and you spent money on something that temporarily. I understand the dilemma. I'm a little concerned about that. We've got this money. We've got to spend it somewhere. That part of it is sounds like government speak to me. That just because you have it, it has to be spent. That
well, I guess
so. I'm a little concerned about that part of it, but I'm really not crazy about this idea. I understand where you're coming from, but then I see you're just delaying the problem, and then 10 years we're going to be right back in a worse shape.
So this came up in a meeting this morning. Dave Johnston with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife brought it up. So we do have a commitment to protect 600 acres of habitat in perpetuity under easement or acquisition. But the other several thousands of acres that we've talked about that we need to support this population, it's written into the plan and the strategy to be under some form of temporary protection. And Dave Johnston, who was involved in the development of the strategy back in the day, he said, in his view, by the end of the permit term, year 50, we need to have some guarantee that that land is going to continue to be managed in perpetuity. So what his view is that land should actually be under some level of permanent protection or have some guarantee attached to it that we know that it's going to continue to be burrowing owl habitat over time. So he and I agreed to put our heads together to come up with some sort of some clarification language on what the actual commitments of the agency are around that, because it's not super clear in the strategy now. But you're right; that is a real issue. And I think the hope, and maybe it is just a hope, but is that if we can really be successful with these temporary agreements where the owls are now, and get the owls to move to areas south of San Jose that are easier to protect and conserve, just on a dollar per acre basis, we'll have a lot more flexibility in how and where we buy land that can be protected in perpetuity. So I mean, it's a stretch for sure, but we've always known that with this burrowing owl strategy, that it's like, I mean, if we took the money that we have now and went and bought land south of San Jose, while the owls in North San Jose get nickel and dime, then we're also lost. So
would the 600 acres that's in the plan, would that support the 220 owls that's the target?
No.
It will not. So you need that extra land.
correct. That's correct. Yeah.
That's a hell of a dilemma.
It's going to be a challenge. I mean, Troy laid it out. We've got about 10 years. I've heard people call it a Hail Mary strategy. the football analogy.
Well, that's, yeah, and,
Yeah.
How often are those successful? That's my point.
Well, we all turned to Doug Flutie back in, 84 was that? So, yeah, it's going to be a challenge, Craig, absolutely. No, we're not spending money just to spend money. But I understand your concern. I would say the agreements with the water treatment plant and with Don Edwards and potentially Mountain View and those publicly owned lands, those will be in perpetuity. And that's what Troy was alluding to, that some of these will try to create sort of a long-term agreement with these entities until the populations of these birds can be established in the South County, and then we can sort of back away from those agreements.
And
Yeah.
those combined would be more than the 600 acres?
Yeah, if somehow birds can be along the Pajaro River, for instance, there's also some properties in the Santa Cruz Mountain area, the valley areas of those properties, agriculture land, ranching land that has ground squirrels, has a lot of the what we would say the habitat constituents of what you would expect burrowing owls to be attracted to, but they're not there. So if somehow they can start nesting there, and we can work out agreements with ranchers or to buy easements or fee title to some of that land, and if the birds can get established in that area, that would become the primary focus of the plan, is enhancing the populations there. But like Troy said, they're not there. So if we buy a bunch of land thinking and the birds crash in North County and there's no birds in South County, the strategy's failed. Yeah, and the permit would be in jeopardy.
But in the Gilroy Morgan Hill sewage treatment plant, it's less developed than the San Jose, Santa Clara. And I would throw out too, all the golf courses from South San Jose on both sides of the valley, they're almost all adjacent to land that is not developed. It's not like you're an urban golf course. So that would seem pretty natural. Could we trap and move the birds?
It's a good question. Something we talked about a lot this morning. It's something that's been done before, but never done successfully for burrowing owls, at least in this area. And it's a pretty high-risk proposition. That would probably be, something that I would term kind of last resort, but it's certainly something that we have available to us in our sort of toolbox. We would have to, before we did that, we would have to do a lot of sort of like pilot program kind of things to make sure that we can do it successfully. But possibly, yeah.
And then Georgia will hop over. But as you folks put this forward, the dilemma about, the Hail Mary and the now to 10 years, is that really the best use if 10 years from now they're not going to be around? And we can't predict that yet.
Yeah,
If you
I
have
think.
no track record for picking them up and moving them successfully, what would be the purpose of growing that population in an area that's not going to sustain them when you have no track record of being able to move them someplace else?
Yeah, the idea is to grow the population where it is and then find lands adjacent or within a kind of typical dispersal range of the birds so they'll move naturally. If we get to a point where we have to actively move them to a new location, I'm not saying it's not possible. It's just it hasn't been done successfully before, but it's only been done once, maybe twice in the area, and in kind of a not haphazard, but like an emergency situation, kind of, right? So not a methodical, scientifically based approach. So
But
that's
if this
what we
land
do.
is so expensive, how are we going to have the resources to buy the land?
Well, that's the utility of the short-term management agreements on the expensive land up in the North Bay area. It's still expensive as you get down the valley, but it's certainly, we're going to be buying a lot of other land down the valley as well for various other species. So it's still expensive by national standards, but it's cheaper relative to, North San Jose 237 frontage kind of land.
Other comments from board members?
I don't understand how you're going to get them to move naturally on their own if you're going to enhance the habitat that they're at. Why are they going to?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's certainly kind of carrying capacity things to think about. So even if you enhance the habitat and make it as great as it can be, if you grow enough owls there, eventually they're going to, there's going to be resource limitations to the point where some owls are going to be pushed out and be looking for new areas to nest, just like any other species would. And so that's really what happens. It's not that they're necessarily thinking, oh, it looks great over there, I'm going to go over there. It's that they kind of get pushed out because there's somewhere else.
Realistic with the areas like the airport to wherever they're going to go First Street and wander around.
Right. There's some studies that have looked at how far birds move between these, or do they move between these populations. There's actually a study going on right now, Lynn Trulio with San Jose State, just starting a study, a banding study to track where owls are moving. We have records of owls moving from Moffett Airfield to San Jose Airport, from San Jose Airport back, and in between these kind of populations. How they find them, who knows? Maybe by accident, but they do move.
Those populations don't migrate.
Typically not. So in the San Jose area, actually in California more generally, we have kind of three types of birds. We have birds that show up here just to nest, and then they may go somewhere else during the winter. And then we have birds that come here just for the winter, and then they go back north to nest. And then we have some birds that stay here all year round. They nest here, and then they winter often in the same exact location, or maybe they winter somewhere else within the area, but they don't go far. So we have birds that do all of those things.
Troy, maybe pull up that map to show where the birds overwinter in the county. So one of the hopes is that the birds that are dispersing to the areas in orange on that map, that they will decide to stay in that area and nest in those yellow areas in the South County.
Yeah, and they overwinter actually all three of these, colors or types that are shown on the map here. They overwinter, on the nesting grounds. They'll stay there, but they will use the hillsides as well. It's interesting because you go to the Altamont, up in Alameda County, and the Altamont, as you know, it's a rolling grassland hills, and there's burrowing owls that nest out there, and what looks like, the Diablo range of Santa Clara County. And so it's, again, one of those kind of confounding things. It's like, well, if they nest in the Altamont in the rolling grasslands, why aren't they nesting in Santa Clara County in the rolling grasslands? And maybe that's something that we'll solve over time. But they behave differently in different locations.
Another question that I'd have to ask is the DNA on a burrowing owl, where we're talking about in Don Edwards. Is that any different than the ones in Altamont Pass? And if so, why are we spending so much money trying to keep them growing in the Don Edwards Reserve?
Yeah, so there's certainly probably some, I don't know for sure, I haven't studied it or anything, but there's certainly some genetic differentiation between the Altamont population and the population that we have in the Bay Area. There could certainly be some exchange between those populations. So a bird, from the Altamont could find its way down here to nest and then, maybe go back and winter up there or what have you. But the one thing that we're seeing that Ed mentioned is that because the population, the individual sites in the South Bay are so constrained, what we're seeing, and this has been observed in other places in California too, where the birds, they end up, because there's not as much exchange between populations, they end up getting this kind of inbreeding situation where they're no longer mating with a stranger, they're mating with their brother and sister and everything else, because there's no other owls around, and they don't actually travel very far. So that's a problem, that's kind of all by itself that we have to deal with, and it affects the viability of the population all its own. But there's enough genetic sort of uniqueness, I think, when you look at, like, you ask the question, like, why are we spending all the money here? Why can't we just, spend it in Alameda County? I think there's enough interest in the sort of local genetic. It's in the Bay Area is a bit of an outlier in the burrowing owl population statewide as well, and so there's enough sort of genetic uniqueness here that it's worth protecting and keeping here. In other words, we don't want to just let it blink out here and know that they're in Alameda County and in the Imperial Valley and other places. We're trying hard to keep a population going here. So.
Do we have any questions, comments from the audience?
We do have a speaker card from Doug Muirhead.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, committee members and staff. For the record, my name is Doug Muirhead. I live in Morgan Hill. I have 2 housekeeping issues and a real question. First housekeeping issue is the presentation that you've just seen for agenda item 3 was not in the packet, was not available as a handout, and so I'd like you to consider how you're going to make presentations available to the public, because this was quite well done, as well as the discussion that you just had. Second housekeeping item is that as you adjourn, you might want to wish happy birthday to your minutes clerk. She's sniffling, so you may not want to hug her, but kind words were probably okay. The real question, because I only had the material for agenda item 4, I only have the map, which was Exhibit B, which talks about potentials to increase burrowing. And if you look at that map starting the South County line, it gives the impression as you move north toward the more developed areas, the potential for increasing burrowing owls decreases, but then of course you hit the northern 4th region and it says that's the highest probability. And perhaps the answer to my question of why is that was the other map that you had that showed where the live owls currently are. So I'm curious if that's the answer to why the highest probability is in the developed area and not in the open space in South County. And then if that's the answer, maybe a little better explanation on potentials would be useful. Thank you.
Thank you. And on your first item about having the materials available, that will be discussed at the end of the meeting.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So a little bit of clarification on that, and it is interesting. The terminology can be tricky at times, I think, but there's certainly lots of potential as you go down the valley, and the yellow on the map, and even in some of the green or some of the orange areas. The reason why the North San Jose Baylands region, that kind of northern, more urbanized region, was listed as having the kind of the highest probability, or maybe more specifically, where the highest conservation focus was going to be, at least initially, is because that's where the owls are. We definitely, as I drive up and down, 101 and look at all the habitat out there, I just for years have scratched my head and tried to figure out why are there not burrowing owls out in some of those places. And if there were, I guarantee that those would be the areas we would be focusing on. It's the biggest conundrum we have is that the place where we have to focus our conservation happens to be in this highly urbanized area. We wish it wasn't that way. It would be much easier if we could do something different. But that's the reason why it's. There's a lot more habitat. There's plenty of suitable habitat down the valley. There just historically haven't been any owls. We're hoping that we can change that.
Jan?
So a couple things I wanted to mention, just in terms of full disclosure that I'm on the board of SFBBO. So I'm kind of an interested party in that sense. But I had 2 questions specifically about the statement of work here. And one was I just wanted to make sure I understood something with respect to management activities at Don Edwards. And the impression I got from the statement of work was that the management activities that we do for burrowing owls are consistent with the management practices required for whatever the other species are, which I'm not aware of, that are being worked on.
Yes, we can
that's
have.
True.
Do you want to? Cat or Adonis?
Okay.
Hi, I'm Kat Burns. I'm the Executive Director of the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory. And yeah, I can confirm that we're working closely with the Warm Springs manager, Yvette Laredo, who can't be here tonight, but hopefully can address you guys sometimes, or you'll get familiar with the site through future discussions. But we've been working closely with her and are assured that all of the management activities that would be going on as part of the scope that we've put before you guys is very consistent and actually beneficial for the other species that they're charged with managing for at the refuge.
Okay, great, great. The other question I had was, it was about the grazing program, and there was a statement that said, basically there's the interest in having short grass, and I think really it's kind of a mix of grasses, short for burrows and longer for insects and such. But there's a statement that said not all fields can be grazed down in the winter to optimize burrowing owl nesting habitat, that some fields would be reserved for summer and fall grazing. And so my question was, I just wanted to understand that a little bit more. Was that to kind of make the grazing practices easier, to kind of have cows year round, or would it actually be better to have more grazing to make more potential sites inviting? Because right now the focus is really on identifying occupied burrows and then making life better for those owls in that vicinity. But if we want to grow the owl population, it's really like we'd want to do at least some more grazing on areas where there are no owls to kind of make some of that habitat more inviting to dispersed populations and whatnot. So I was kind of curious what the trade-offs were there for the amount of grazing.
There are some logistical limitations to what can be altered about the grazing regime there, but I don't as much more familiar with the site history of grazing and their plans, so I'm going to turn it over to her.
Hi, my name is Aitana Kakuris, and I am ecologist for SCV. The whole Warm Springs site is divided in temperatures, and there are about 2 herds of animals. They rotate grazing. They have a rotating grazing program over the year. If you actually, logistically speaking, it will be very difficult to support this many animals to keep the vegetation low through all the year. Because remember that this is an arid environment, okay? During summer, we don't have this much green grass, okay? So you have to reserve some fields to move them, when they are done with the areas that they started in spring, and vice versa. Overall, though, you should not expect, overall the vegetation in Warm Springs stay short, but if you focus on nesting areas, and that's what we wish for, because overall you will not see like ruderal vegetation, right? You'll see generally low vegetation. We just want to make sure that the nesting areas are really low. Another benefit to have some actually fields that they are not grazed is to be used as a foraging habitat. Because if you keep everything very low, then you have so much dry conditions, you don't have really a lot of insects. And in summer, at least in Warm Springs, at least through their pellets, the owls seem to feed mostly on insects right now.
So
have I answered your question?
Yeah, I think so. It does sound like then with the grazing program that we would get kind of a patchwork of kind of short grass and longer grass.
Yes.
Some short grass, probably around ground squirrel burrows that are unoccupied. So we would get kind of a mix that would provide other opportunities for dispersing owls to potentially use as breeding
Yes.
places, yeah.
And another note here is that the refuge didn't acquire all the fields at the same time, and initially when they acquired the land, they stopped grazing because they were not sure of the effects of the grazing on the listed species, which is Contracosta goldfields, vernal pool tageable shrimp, and California tiger salamander. And they realized actually that the fact that they stopped grazing the land, they did an experimental study, had a negative effect on this, so they reinitiate grazing and very carefully within 6-7 years, they were, slowly introducing and very closely monitoring the results, and they found that it did good to all of these species. Also, there was a study from WRA on the owls, and they found also that grazing did very well did a good thing to owls, because basically what happened is that it triggered ground squirrel activity. And yeah, this is an added benefit of grazing.
Great, thanks. That was very informative.
Other questions? Good. So then, do want to thank you for the presentation, and I think we found it informative, and think you'll also have some things to incorporate to take on to the next two boards. So the next item on the agenda, Ed, you're up.
Can I ask one question on it?
Yes.
Not about the owl, but the process. So as this group, we'll be doing this on an ongoing basis. So are our comments taken to the next two groups as comments, or is there a specific recommendation made to them? What exactly happens from what we've just been through to the next?
Yeah, we're all new at this process, so the way I sort of envisioned it, your comments would be taken back. Well, some of your comments may inform the proposal, and it may lead to some changes in the proposal. And your comments will definitely go to the TAC and the implementation board.
If there are changes made as a result of our comments, would we know that?
I can notify you of that, yes.
That would be helpful to know
and
and
then also,
get some feedback.
Yeah, and not only feedback, but it gives a reason for us being here.
Well, yeah, but if we don't know if we're doing any good, or
Right.
if anybody's even listening to us, then we don't know. But if we do know that, then that'd be helpful. So, okay.
Yes,
And I know that's all new. That's why I'm asking now.
Yes, and I'm listening. So since I'm the only staff person of the agency.
You have nothing else to do, don't you?
All right, and so your report tonight.
Sure. Just we'll post this presentation to the webpage if that would help. I was thinking as it was being presented, it would have been good if you guys have seen it ahead of time too. But yeah.
Well, and in fact, I would ask that be almost on the checklist. Can it be given to the agency in time, the graphs, but he gave us a lot of good information.
Yes.
that I may well want to refer back to and may need to.
Right.
And so if we have that in the packet, and answering Doug's thing, if it's in the packet, then it's available to anyone and everyone. And if in the event there's not time, then or even if it's available a couple of days ahead of time, rather than the time to prepare and then mail and that kind of stuff, if we could have some here for the public,
Sure.
and then copies for the board members as well. And if it could be, I mean, yes, it almost gets cumbersome, but that the more information we have ahead of time, then we can even shorten presentations and, you know, and concentrate more on asking questions, points of emphasis, rather than hearing information for the first time.
Oh, I thought you had excellent questions, so I have no complaints there. But yeah, we can definitely do a better job of getting the presentation to the PAC members ahead of time, and I'll make sure this is put up on the webpage.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, one last time for public comment from anyone.
I wanted to pass out this to the board. It's just some information about grazing and what ranchers have done to improve grazing for habitat and everything, if that's okay.
Thank you. And it's interesting, while we're passing this out, the tour of the Kirby Canyon grazing was, and I'm just, Joe Citizen out there. I had no idea how important it is to the bay checker spot butterfly. In fact, it's absolutely essential, and that this, we're learning that for the burrowing owl, absolutely essential. So it's yes.
Well, have we sort of moved on to the last item? Is that where we're at here? The future?
Yes, future agenda items.
Okay. I really don't know if this is appropriate, but...
Oh, do you want me to give you an I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And we'll see if Julie's list is down by one.
Yeah. So, talked to Liz Cabrillo, the new Farm Bureau Executive Officer, Director, and she submitted an application. We had a process to solicit applications to get another representative for the farming and ranching community to be on this stakeholder group. And Liz was the only person that submitted an application. I sat down and talked to her, and she seems more than qualified to represent the farming ranching community, I think, on this board. So we're going to recommend that the board appoint her to the PAC to replace Jennifer Shear.
And the board is that the governing board or the implementation board?
Implementation board, yes. And a couple items of good news. The Section 6 program, which is through the Endangered Species Act, there's two components of it. One is planning. So a lot of the money that was used to develop this plan came from the Section 6 federal program. It's administered by the state to develop the plan. Well, because of the plan, our partner OSA put in a Section 6 grant and was successful in getting a Section 6 grant for $2 million that will go towards the purchase of the UTC property on Coyote Ridge, so the 1,881 acres. And that grant was
Is that us?
It's through it's kind of, if the plan wasn't here and the agency wasn't here, OSA would have never got the money.
Okay.
So OSA submitted the grant on behalf of the co-permittees, and so they technically were the ones that wrote the grant, but without the plan, they could have never gotten the money. So there's another round of Section 6 money coming up, and we're talking to landowners, the ones that we're aware of that would be interested in selling land to the agency. And so hopefully with this next round, we'll have a willing landowner, willing seller who wants to sell part of their land or all their land. And so
there's probably parts we don't want, though, too.
Oh, you're talking about the rest of UTC? Yeah.
Yes.
I did contact. I was out at their site last month, and it's an amazing site. But yeah, there are areas we don't want. Yes. And then we also were fortunate enough to. There's a state program called the Local Assistant Grant Program, and we got one to help us with thinking about grazing and working on the reserve land, and to try to use remote sensing and some more sort of high-tech approaches to grazing and monitoring grazing lands. And so we got a grant to sort of do that sort of study work and work with the ranching community to kind of come up with some ideas on how to monitor and understand grazing and how it benefits species and the landscape in general. And we also got a grant for, well, we didn't get it. It was the San Francisco Bay Estuary Institute. They applied for the money, but they're, again, because of the plan, they got the money because of the existence of the plan, and they're going to be doing a study on sycamores and sort of what's kind of going wrong with that sort of unique habitat niche. There's a lot of die-offs with sycamores, and water management seems to be one of the issues that might be a limiting factor, and why sycamores are doing well in some areas and not in others. So it's a grant to sort of study that issue. And one of the things that the plan, one of the requirements of the plan is sort of to do scientific research and study problems and try to come up with solutions to them. So that's some of the good news. In addition, I'll just go over quickly the agenda for the implementation board on November 20th, just for you guys to get a sense of what I'll be bringing to the board. We're developing contracting policies, so sort of rules for hiring firms to do work for us. So sort of general service rules for, so that would be for, if we wanted to hire someone to do grazing on one of our lands, or we wanted to hire someone to do some scientific research, or so something that would be more, or if we're going to buy software packages for accounting and budgeting, that we have a process for being able to hire the firms and and how the RFP is. We also are developing one for public works, so it would be like restoration projects and construction projects. The Wildlife Agency Co-Permittee Group is formally going to be called the Technical Advisory Committee. So even though this group's been meeting, they were not formally the Technical Advisory Committee. So now we're going to formally call them the Technical Advisory Committee, and the implementation board has to make that so. And that'll be on...
Is that the agency folks?
Yes, exactly.
The group that Crystal and I were at?
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. So it was an informal group, so now we're formalizing it. Yeah, it's not a Brown Act group, but still, it was something that the plan said you need to form a TAC, and it was never formed, so now we're formally doing that, and the board will be approving that. We're also going to be doing a contract, sort of an MOU with the county parks to be sort of our point person for helping us with grant writing and sort of they have a grant writer on staff, and this will, I don't have enough time to write the grant, so this will be somebody that will be able to help us and hopefully bring in a lot more funding into the agency.
We don't pay them unless they get the money.
Exactly. I probably should put some performance standards in the contract. We're also going to be changing the date of when, for some reason they chose June 1st as when the fees, every year the fees potentially could go up based on land costs and inflation, and so they chose June 1st as the date for when fees would increase potentially or not. So we've said that's not consistent with all the operating budgets of July 1, so we're changing the date to July 1. And also ICF, their contract expires at the end of this year, so we're going to do an amendment to their contract that dates back all the way to 2005. This will be the last of those amendments. In the summer, we're going to go out, do solicitation for firms to bid on providing services to the agency from this point forth. And of course, ICF can bid on it.
You do that every X number of years anyway.
Yes, exactly. So this will be the last of these amendments to that original contract. The agency will the next contract will be directly with the agency. And we're also going to begin the discussion with the board to talk about adding staff for the agency. So I'm going to, you know, even though I'm amazing and I can do everything. Exactly. So I could at least begin the discussion with the board to kind of get a sense of if they're open to the agency adding staff. So, yeah.
Talk to the implementation board.
Yes, exactly. And that's on the agenda for a couple of weeks. I'm trying to think there's anything else. So yeah, we have been talking to landowners. I visited several properties, and Kyle, if you know anybody in the ag community that's interested in selling a conservation easement on their land, or if they want to sell their land outright, be interested in talking to them. So thank you. Great meeting and great questions. And now to the, I guess, future agenda item stuff.
Before we go into that,
yes.
Julie, was there anything more that you wanted to talk about with future agenda items? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes.
It's a suggestion, not an absolute, of course. And there's a nexus with what Ed just brought up, and that is site visits. They would have to obviously be done not at this time of the day, but I would suggest that maybe we consider one at least for within the next year. If there's, you know, something I think at the top of my list of enjoying my own work, it's being able to get out on a site and really...
Night vision goggles.
We could go there, but I don't know if the agency is going to pony up the dough for that. But yeah, site visits are really great because they help you get on the ground and understand things from another perspective aside from sitting here and getting a report. So I would suggest at one point in time we choose a location that would be conducive to.
We could do a couple sites. I forgot to mention where both the county and OSA, as part of this plan, are going to roll lands. So some of the lands that are existing as county parks or OSA properties will be enrolled into the reserve system. So we're starting that process. It's a long process, unfortunately. And we have to do a reserve area management plan in conjunction with that, and an easement over their land. So it's quite the process. But I figure the site visit could be to visit Clara. That's one of the areas we'll be enrolling. There's also an OSA property in Coyote Valley that will be enrolled. And also the UTC site, the Coyote Ridge. So we could visit all three of those sites if the PAC so deems it that they would like to. And we could probably carve out half a day to do that.
Just soon, I've been leading hikes on Coyote Ridge for 7 years now, so
okay.
That would easily do that. So
okay, perfect.
I'd love to take everybody up there.
Yeah, at bare minimum we could do that, and maybe at the February meeting if we can pull it off.
No, I think April is usually kind of the wildflower.
April,
yeah.
May.
All right. How about the May 7th meeting?
Should be pretty good.
Okay.
As long as we don't have too dry weather,
right.
that should be
That's
good.
assuming we get some rain.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I definitely second that. I've been on the hikes with Craig, and very entertaining, educational.
Yeah, we can arrange that for sure. Yeah.
Julie, others? No. Okay. Any other item? Then do we have anything else before us? But I don't think we need to sing happy birthday, but we definitely want to acknowledge and that you could have called in sick. But you'll have a little time to go out and celebrate, and maybe even more time if you call in sick tomorrow at City Hall.
Well, thank you.
I want to specifically thank ICF, SFBBO, and Audubon for being here and providing a lot of the information. We really appreciate you guys, okay?
All right, so then if we will be adjourned at 8:12 p.m. And thank you all.
Thank you.